That was Shu Desi reporting from Damascus. Well, there is much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Joining us from Doha is Middle East and North Africa analyst Rouwan Al-Rejoleh. With us from Moscow is writer and political analyst Dmitry Forlovsky. Metin Gurcan is a security analyst and columnist for Al Monitor's Turkey Pulse. He joins us from Istanbul. And with us from London is Syria analyst and journalist Danny Mackey. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Danny, let me start with you in London. The latest reports we're getting that the rebels are refusing to leave this demilitarized zone in Idlib province. So given that, where does this leave the plan to clear the province of rebels?
Well, this has definitely become a big conundrum in recent times. I mean, there have been rebel groups which have withdrawn weapons beforehand, but the bigger statement came yesterday when Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is the Al-Qaeda affiliate, essentially stated they would continue to fight and they would continue this jihad in a long, fiery statement yesterday. And this is kind of what the Russians and Assad were really expecting. This would be the perfect prerequisite to think about the Idlib offensive in more detail now, after having this period of assessing the different options. With Hayat Tahrir al-Sham in Idlib, it does provide a huge problem both for Turkey and for Russia, and this will definitely add to Assad's incentive and Russia's to attack Idlib in the foreseeable future. But the bigger problem we have is balancing Hayat Tahrir al-Sham with these other rebel groups, some of which have actually withdrawn weapons and wanted to under the auspice of Turkey. But Idlib is a huge problem now because it's the last real bastion of the rebels within Syria, and it's definitely a province which would threaten Turkish interests, having such a close presence to the border. And it's been on the map for Russia and Assad for a number of years now, and I still think that an offensive will take place, as the Russians would definitely want to secure some of the towns around Idlib, especially near Latakia, which have been bombing their base in Hamaymim through drones, and that is Jisr al-Shughur and Saraqib. And perhaps Idlib city, which would be a major milestone for them to take eventually.
Right.
But in terms of Idlib near the Turkish border, it still remains to be seen what will happen. And there is a very big regional dynamic and an international one which needs to take into account the interests of all of these parties involved, because it's a geopolitical hall of mirrors and it's very complicated.
Danny, tell me very quickly, do you see military action? I mean, we heard from the Syrian foreign minister, he warned of potential military action. Do you see military action as being inevitable at this stage?
It's going to be inevitable at some point, but I do have doubts whether that will happen at the moment when you have a winter approaching. Idlib is a very it's a very countryside-esque area with hills, mountains, caves, it's forest. It's tough to wage a war there in winter. So I think an early spring offensive will be on the cards for Assad and Russia.
Right.
But it is inevitable. Eventually, there will be an offensive.
Okay, Metin Gurcan, this was a plan which was endorsed by Turkey. In fact, it was formulated in part by Turkey. It was endorsed by the president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Now it appears to be faltering. So where does that leave Turkey?
Yeah, I mean, Ankara, the capital of Turkey, has been trying to separate those good guys, moderates, from the bad guys, radicals or terrorists, for almost a year. And this was a Russia-endorsed process. And right now, we have seen the last stage. Right now, Moscow has deliberately sent this message to Ankara that it's almost done, with its patience, and then things should be much more solidified. And right now, what we see is the end of this negotiation process. So right now, to some extent, I would say, Ankara has been successful to separate those moderates from the radicals or terrorists, but I would suggest that nearly 25 to 30% of those HTS-linked groups seems to continue their resistance in and around Idlib. We are talking about around 25 to 30,000 guys, radicals, and I'm expecting that nearly 25 to 30%, making 6,000 to 7,000 fighters, will seem to be resisting against these negotiations and will be preparing for the coming fight.
Right, let me bring in Rouwan from Doha in Qatar. And Rouwan, the picture does not look very good. We've heard from our other guests here as well. If the fighters in Idlib do not evacuate, what kind of options are left to the Syrian government? I mean, we heard of one option, which is potential military action, but is there any other option?
Sure, I agree with Mr. Makki on that the military operation is inevitable. However, we need to differentiate. I agree also with my colleague from Turkey about the foreign fighters, but about the fighters. But we need to differentiate the foreign ones from the Syrians, the national, and their ideologies. For instance, the HTS fighters and the Hurras ad-Din fighters, they are foreign fighters, and that's the problem that Turkey and Russia currently are having and facing. So there are Turkey currently is likely know who is who on the fighters, the Islamist ones that are under the NFL, the National Front, that consists other Islamist groups. I don't want to get into names. But the fact is that the foreign fighters is the challenge that Turkey and Russia are facing, and there are two options: whether or not they will be moved to other area in the territories that are held by Turkey, or to be escorted outside of the country to their original countries, and that's another international problem that Turkey is facing.
Right. Okay, Danny, very quickly, and then I want to go to Moscow. Go ahead.
I mean, absolutely. I agree to the extent that there is a big issue of balancing between the radical groups and the more kind of nationalistic, more moderate groups. But the problem is that Idlib is such a complex dynamic, which you don't know exactly which groups are working where, and it's tough to identify this. But what we now have is an absence of the role of the US, which is why you have this Turkish-Russian negotiation. But you don't have this external power or superpower either from Europe or the US taking a stance on Idlib, which is generally a threat to the whole world. It's not just a Syria, Russia, Turkey dynamic. You know, these foreign fighters will be going back to Europe, they could go back to America, so it's a security threat for everyone. So it's surprising that you only have the Turks and the Russians really dealing with this and negotiating on it. You know, Idlib could go very wrong, because if these foreign fighters start going back to Europe, all sorts of terrorist activities could occur. So it's essential that states begin to actually bring these sides closer together. Now, some of the Syrian rebels have withdrawn, but the others, you know, what do you do with Al-Qaeda? It's really a very tough question.
All right. Let's go to Dimitri and get the view from Russia. Dimitri, we just heard Idlib could go very wrong. How important and significant is this plan for Russia and what it's doing in Syria right now?
If you look at the general Russian strategy in Syria and everything, I think even in retrospective might help a little bit, might help in that matter. A few months ago, when there was the operation in the south in Syria, when coming to an end, and when some of the rebels were actually offered opportunities to lay their arms and move to Idlib, few of them were actually warned that the operation in Idlib is about to start in September. And the troops of Russian troops, Iranian troops, and the Bashar Assad troops were also preparing to attack in Idlib. And obviously, as was already mentioned, that Idlib right now is the last bastion of rebellion in Syria. And obviously for Russia and for Bashar Assad, it's important to do something about it. So Russians were prepared to attack in Idlib, but this agreement right now, in my opinion, it actually helped to delay this attack. But at the same time, I would agree with previous speaker that this operation is still largely inevitable and will likely take place sometimes in the spring or later in a few months. Also, I would like to mention on to address the issue of the rebels, and I think that this is very complicated when we start to thinking how to differentiate between the radicals and the moderate. Right in the eyes of Russians or the Syrians, pretty much most of them are most of them are equally dangerous, and it will be almost impossible to integrate them in the future political process, or pretty complicated.
Right, Ruan, maybe you could help us with that. How big a problem is that, the problem that Dimitri just talked about, differentiating moderate rebels from those who are more militant?
Yes, his perspective is understandable. However, you need to understand the dynamics that, you know, there has been a revolution in Syria, and there were people that are opposing the Assad regime. And the more you use the force, the more people get radicalized. So there, on the other hand, there are Islamist factions that left from Dar'a and from Ghouta, eastern Ghouta, that are somehow backed by Turkey Islamist factions that are kind of moderate with a version of a future for Syria that we might not agree on, however, but they can be integrated within and that's the conversation that Turkey and Russia and Astana are having, is to create a new political body.
Right, Metin Gurcan, what kind of, let's say, military muscle is Turkey prepared to put behind this, to implement this plan?
Let me say this. I mean, the key question here is how to separate those good guys, moderates, from the bad guys, terrorists or radicals. According to sources on the ground, we have 3 criteria. You know, the Turkish intelligence elements right now, they are engaging with those groups. And HTS, Al-Qaeda linked, you know, HTS is not a monolithic entity, as we know. It's an umbrella organization, and more than 20 different factions or armed groups are inclined to affiliate themselves with HTS. So what are those 3 criteria to separate those good guys from the bad guys? The first criteria is, you know, the moderates should say, the moderate groups should say that they have local perspective limited within Syria. So if you are a group, armed Sunni group, with a global or regional perspective, and then your vision is beyond Syria, then it's impossible for you to define you as a moderate. The second criteria is those moderates should say openly that they should respect to the democratic processes, particularly the elections. You know, those jihadists, the radicals, they are declining the fact that democracy is a political system, it's a man-made system, and they are saying that it's impossible to implement democracy, so they do not respect to democracy. And the third criterion is to be used to separate those moderates from the bad guys is, you know, those groups should say openly that they are ready to negotiate everything with any other group on the table, regardless of the other parties' ethnic, sectarian, and religious background. So if you accept these 3 criteria, then you are defined as a moderate group. And what is the issue at hand is, right now, I think the intelligence elements, they are really trying hard to engage with those guys in Idlib, and they have an offer to those guys, you know, trying to control Idlib. If they stay in Idlib, then everything will be okay for them.
Right.
But they have to lay down their arms and demobilize. So which kind of military operation should we expect in the coming weeks? I think I do not expect I do not expect a grand scale military operation. What we will see is very precise special operations supported with very precise airstrikes to neutralize or to eliminate those critical leaders constituting the radical how can I say, factions within HTS.
All right, let me go to Danny. Danny, you heard that strategy. Do you think it's something that's going to work?
Well, I disagree with the fact that you could kind of sever the head of the snake and then the foot soldiers will all become moderate, because these people who've been in Al-Qaeda or Hayat Tahrir al-Sham or previously Jabhat al-Nusra for 4 or 5 or 6 years. I mean, they've been embedded in Idlib for a very long time. And you can't just take HTS from Idlib and put it elsewhere, because a lot of these people are not foreigners. Most of them are actually Syrian, as opposed to ISIS, which relies more on foreigners. HTS is a majority Syrian group, and a lot of these people are not just from Idlib. They're from Damascus, they're from Dar'a, they're from Quneitra, they're from Homs, Hama, Aleppo. These people have been bussed to Idlib from all other areas of the Syria conflict where they've been defeated. So it's not just a dynamic of you know, allowing HTS to become moderate, because it's almost impossible. Attacking the head of HTS has been what the Americans, what the Russians, what the Syrians, what the Turks have done for the last 4 or 5 years, and it's really had no genuine effect, because as soon as you kill one leader, another 10 come out. You know, it's difficult to defeat them militarily in that way.
Dimitri, I mean, we hear what's going on in Syria right now. We hear about this plan and the risks that are inherent in this plan. What is Russia's ultimate aim in Syria? Does Russia want to see a reunified Syria back to, say, 2011?
I think here it's interesting if you look at what is Russia's long-term goals in the region, right? For the first thing when the just operation just started, there was no questions about the possibility of restoring the Syrian territorial integrity. It is actually the Bashar al-Assad and even Iranians who are actually pushing Russia forward to drive away all the opposition fractions mentioned to restore the territorial integrity of Syria in its pre-war borders. For Russia, actually, right now, it's better to have its stronghold. It's sufficient, actually, to have its stronghold in Latakia and perhaps other parts of the country that are relatively protected so that it could have a foothold in the region. And so this way it could influence the regional dynamics as well as possibly pressure its competitors on global energy markets in the Persian Gulf. So it's the integrity of Syria wasn't the matter for Russia for some time at least. Right now, when we see that pretty much most of the rebel fighters and groups are defeated, and the last enclave is in Idlib, and Bashar al-Assad and Iranians are actually on the full swing and ready to restore the entire, to get the entire territory of the country under their control, Russia obviously would follow this path. So it is in a sense it's complicated, but for Russia I believe that would be enough to have certain just parts of territories, not the entire territory.
Ruwan, I want to get your view on some of what we've heard about how this process goes forward. I mean, one of the tactics we've heard is that the leadership of these rebel groups be targeted, and that way these groups can be defeated. The other is that there could be some kind of a conflict, which might be protracted, but it'd be one way of moving them out of this area. What do you make of it?
So we need to look at this from two perspectives, from international and from a Syrian perspective. For instance, Idlib is the main crossing of Idlib has been under the control of HTS. HTS has been running as a civilian government called the Salvation Government, which is parallel to the interim government that is, the official representative of the Syrian opposition. So the fact that the HTS has been operating within a civilian body, controlling the cross borders, that means that the HTS has been controlling the trade, the flow of money, and even the operation of the civil society organizations in Idlib. HTS, on terms of territory, many reports say that it controls 60% of it, and they are the front lines with the regime government. The problem is when we say moderate and extreme, when we say the HTS most of them are Syrian and they will stay in Syria. So one of your guests mentioned that there is no global jihadism. So as long as they're gonna stay in Syria and they will be less extreme in their views, then they are acceptable. They're not into jihad per se, violence, so they won't pose risk on any other but the Syrians. So are the Syrians going to accept them? That's another discussion. But as long as they are going to stay within the borders, the problem is that is posed for everyone is the foreign fighters. That's the problem, and that's where Turkey and Russia at the moment are discussing it and where to go, whether inside Syria to other territories, Euphrates Shields maybe, Manbij maybe, or outside of the borders of Turkey.
Danny, that's an important point that Ruwan raises there. I mean, there are different groups here. I mean, why would they want to agree to this? Why would they suddenly turn from being fighters and militants to suddenly agreeing with the Syrian government, absent a legally enforceable agreement that everybody signs on to?
Well, it's decision time, isn't it, essentially, because they've reached this point. It's 2018. The insurrection has essentially failed to achieve its main objective of overthrowing Assad. You've got Russia, which is acting as a patron now within Syria, and it's up to these groups to define how this war is going to go on, for not just the fighters, but for the people living under their control at the moment. The bigger problem is, where do we go from now? And HTS, I mean, I agree with the fact that the Syrian fighters from HTS won't want to go abroad. They'd want to stay in Syria, and that is relatively manageable. But the foreign fighters, it will be very tough. I think other opposition fighting groups, it will be much easier to find a solution which works well for everyone. And because you have this kind of tri-dynamic of Russia, Turkey, and the Assad government, we'll be able to find a reconciliation or a solution for Idlib where, it might have some sort of private autonomy for the time being. But in the future, it's going to be very difficult to bring all of these groups together, especially when all of them aren't from Idlib. Now that is where the power of Russia as a power broker and as a diplomatic negotiator between these groups, as it's done elsewhere in Damascus and Homs, will come into effect.
Okay, Ron, very quickly, go ahead.
Very quickly, to answer your question, the main motivation for any armed extreme group or armed group is to have a say on the table. They are looking for political gain. So they are willing to put down their arms when they are accepted and negotiated as part of political elements. So once they get that, they're more likely to be cooperating with the process.
Dimitri, we've talked about Russia's involvement, Turkey's involvement, as well as, well, to some extent, Iran's involved as well, but we've not talked about the United States. Danny mentioned it earlier on, but where do you see the United States go with this? Do you see a clear strategy from Washington here?
Well, just before I go to the United States, just want to refer to the previous point, if possible, briefly. I think if we speak about the upcoming reconciliation or reintegration of those fighters into Syrian environment, it largely depends on what regimes will decide, because ultimately it's victorious right now. And what we've seen in the past is that regime is actually, whether it provides guarantees or not, it ultimately doesn't see the future of these fighters within the Syrian society. So I think this is very dangerous right now, and I don't think that actually reconciliation is actually very much possible within the current settings. And in regards to the United States, I think even we haven't seen a clear and coherent strategy in regards to Syria for a very, very long time. It hasn't been there during the Obama administration. It's not there under Trump, and we see there's conflicting views coming from the White House, conflicting views, different views come from the Pentagon, and different views coming from the Congress. And I don't think that there is any coherency in regards to Syria in the United States. Pretty much, I think what will dominate in the future is what Trump will ultimately decide, and that's probably going to be the decrease of United States influence in Syria, and that actually plays well to Russia's interest.
Metin Gurcan, I've just got about a minute left, and there's been a warning from the United Nations that there will be a major loss of life, a humanitarian catastrophe, as the UN called it, if the Syrian military decides to fight its way into Idlib. This is a place which is home to 3 million people. How big are the risks of that happening?
Yep. Yeah. I mean, for a grand-scale operation, I'm talking about a sort of operation like we witnessed 2 years ago in Aleppo. It was an very grand scale, very conventional operation. Massive airstrikes with dump munitions and big military movements and sort of siege warfare. These are the things that we don't want to see in and around Idlib, because Idlib is the last stronghold for those Sunni opposition groups, and we are talking about a city 10 times with the population of 10 times bigger than the population that it had 6 years ago. So from 300,000 population to 3 million people, civilians, they are living there. So the consequences will be very dire. So that's why both Moscow and Ankara has been very keen to use both carrots and sticks to try to play them simultaneously. So Assad forces involvement to the game will be, and also those Shia fighters right now controlling the south of Aleppo and the east of Idlib, they have also posed a great threat. So that's why Moscow and Ankara are very careful to manage this delicate situation without big involvement of Assad forces and without the involvement of those Shia fighters. Because if those Shia fighters, for instance, get involved in the Idlib conundrum, then what we will see is a big sectarian civil war that none of the actors having states in the north of Syria would want and would accommodate.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. We've run out of time. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.